Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to actually invite two guests to the stage for this afternoon's briefing, Major Jason Newcomer and also Dr. Dan Connolly. Just in brief about the two of them, Major Jason Newcomer is the Director of Operations at the 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron in Hill Air Force Base. He has a doctorate in Business Administration, specializing in organizational leadership, a master's in aeronautics, as well as a master's from the one and only Air Command and Staff College. Most of you already know Dr. Dan Connolly. He's an assistant professor here at ACSC in the Department of International Security. What's special about these two is while Major Newcomer was a student here, he actually participated in the independent study program. Dr. Dan Connolly was his mentor and advisor, and so today they're going to present some of their findings from Major Newcomer's research. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Major Newcomer and Dr. Dan Connolly.
So for those of you out there, you know that when you walk past that thing while talking, it makes that awful noise, and I promise not to do that to you because I've been out there, and that's awful. When I first joined the Air Force, it was in 1998. I came in enlisted, I was an Airman Basic, and that introduced me to my first experience of military leadership versus management versus mentoring. And I didn't really know before joining the Air Force what the difference were between those concepts. But then I had a tech sergeant that changed my life, that was my shift supervisor, and we'll just call him Tim, that was his actual first name. And so Tim was a fantastic manager. He was great at scheduling, resourcing, making sure the crews were shifted properly. Tim was also a great mentor for me, where he's the guy that said, hey, you know what, I waited too long to go to school, you should start on school now. That eventually turned into ROTC, that turned into lieutenant, that's now major, soon to be lieutenant colonel. And that's all because this tech sergeant mentored me on my way up. Tim was not a great leader because he was not able to motivate and inspire the people on his crew. Folks followed Tim because he was the shift supervisor, and they accomplished the tasks. Our crew was effective. We received the airplane each day, we inspected it, we made repairs, and we sent the airplane back off for another flight and did that over and over without fail. So we were effective, but we were not as effective as we could be because our leadership team was lacking a certain element. Now, most of you that are here for ACSC, in your leadership course, you had a book by Shine where you reviewed organizational culture, or org culture. And one of the pieces in that are subcultures and microcultures. We talk about an organization, you have a culture, right? And then it breaks down a little further, and you might have a piece of the organization that has a slightly different culture than another piece. So our shift was a subculture of the overall squadron that happened to have the same issues at the squadron level. And I would offer that many squadrons today have the same type of issue where the work gets done. The Air Force doesn't fail in our mission. We get the mission done. And several of you from other countries and other organizations probably see the same thing, where things aren't optimal, but they get done. So if we have an opportunity before going into command, if you have an opportunity to gain advice, not from me, I haven't been a commander. You can see up there, I'm a squadron DO. Commander's next for me. Dan has not been a commander. He's here as a professor. But we have interviewed multiple squadron commanders, and I'll bring up the exact numbers in a little bit. But if you can take their experience and things that they said, hey, I wish I knew this sooner. This is my 2 years or 1 year of knowledge I gathered during my command. And you can walk out of here whether you've already had a command, you're going to a second command, or you're going to your first command, or maybe you're going to a higher level command at some point because you've been a squadron commander and eventually you'll be a group commander. You can provide this advice down. I feel like there's something that you can take away from this brief no matter what your position is, because we got a lot of great information, and I actually forgot to grab the clicker. Do you have that up there, Dan? Thanks. Appreciate it. So we're going to share with you what we learned during the research process, and hopefully you'll find something to take out of that. So why is that important? So AFI 38101 Air Force Organization talks about the squadron being the basic building block of the Air Force. Chief of Staff has mentioned that. We actually have a whole entire initiative set, the very first one of revitalizing the squadron, because it's that important. So if you're this board gentleman up here on the wall, and you have the world record for the largest house of cards ever built, and this were the Air Force, the squadron would be right about there, right? Pretty important piece, especially in something as fragile as a house of cards. So if you think about the DoD and even the Air Force, micro down to the Air Force is a lot like a house of cards. How many squadrons can we afford to lose? Not a lot. We downsize, we select which pieces we take away or which pieces we add to build the foundation, but we can't afford to involuntarily lose too many of those squadrons, because when you do, then you start to lose the whole house. So if this house does represent the Air Force, then of course Air University will be back here, and then you right now are right there in wood. So just to kind of give you some perspective on where you sit. We interviewed 30 graduated squadron commanders, which was a great number. Anybody here is familiar with qualitative research? When you're looking at qualitative research, you're really looking for the depth of knowledge from somebody's experience. So you're interviewing people to understand not only what happened, but why what happened. And that's what I want to share with you today is the why behind the what. So I'll give you the what and then I'll give you the why. But instead of just having the normal desired 10 to 20 responses for surveys, I was aiming for 15 when we started, but we actually got double that because there's so many commanders that were willing to sit down and give us their time. So that improved the quality of the information, the richness, and certainly appreciative. The first bar up top represents the demographic of the functional area of expertise of the commanders. They're not related, so number 1 is not an operations AFMC commander. They're not connected. There's a black line in between. The top bar shows the diversity of functional area. So we have a mix of ops, support, medical, because the intent here is not to give you an ops squadron commander's perspective or give you a medical squadron commander's perspective. Our intent was to make sure we can provide knowledge that's generalizable no matter where you take command or how you take command. These are things that apply to commanders everywhere. And the things that didn't happen frequently enough in the interviews for them to make the frequency tables and bring it to you in this presentation. So everything that we're going to talk to you about is generalizable across command. The bottom bar shows the difference between MAGCOMs. Every MAGCOM has a little bit different culture when it comes to command. The commander's course is different. The focus is different. AMC culture is different. I'm in ACC as Airfield Ops guy. I've been to ACC, AMC, ATC, the Pentagon, and all of them have different climates. So the climate, these things transcend the climate. They transcend the functional area. So these are the areas that we looked at. There's different leadership models out there. There's a 10-star leadership model, which is one I kind of focused on for organizations. And you can see there's not 10 elements up here. Obviously, there's 7. There's some things that don't fit to the squadron, right? Like strategy, which you have usually at the wing level or higher, but mostly at the Air Force level. There's high-level leadership development, which is what our Air Force A1DI does for DTs and vectoring and things like that. So we took the things that didn't apply to the squadron level, pulled them out. We were left with 7 things that definitely apply to the squadron level. And then we interviewed commanders on each of these elements. And I'm going to run through I'm going to define these very quickly for you just so as we continue the briefing, you understand what I mean when I say customer service, when I say leadership. So I'll start with leadership. The leadership piece, that is the leadership team. That is the team of leaders in the unit and how effective or ineffective, because we got both responses, they were at leading their organization. This is the commander, the DO, the first sergeant, senior civilian, senior NCOs, flight commanders, whatever it was for that unit, that was the leadership team. So based on what type of unit we were interviewing a commander from, it might have been a contracting squadron or a comptroller squadron that had maybe 2 or 3 senior leaders, or it could have been something a lot larger, large security forces squadron, large training squadron, an OSS, something bigger that has senior civilians, first sergeants, superintendent that's a chief, all these different leadership impacts. So when we talked about the effectiveness of the leadership team with these commanders, we were talking about that team of people, and we got different responses from them based on what their team composition was, and we'll talk about that a little bit during the briefing. Training is training, so we're looking at everything, ancillary training, all the CBT stuff, the computer-based stuff we have to do. We're looking at 797 training, so local tasks, mission qualification training. How effective or ineffective was your unit at preparing your airmen to perform the mission that your unit's tasked with through the mission directive? Customer service, everybody here, we all provide a service to somebody. So every squadron, no matter where you are or what you do, has some form of output in the form of some value that it gives to a parallel or a larger part of our organization to accomplish our mission. So how you transfer that value to the person, group, or organization receiving that value, that is the customer service piece. Does that make sense to everybody? We're good with that? So some of the operators had harder time understand what I meant by customer service. Wait, we are the customer. We fly. So everybody provides value out. Performance improvement. This is how we motivate and change behavior to be in line with what we need to accomplish our job. So we maintain positive performance by doing certain things. We change or try to change negative performance by taking certain actions. So when we talk about performance improvement, we're talking about those actions, those things, those processes that are done to change behavior. Communication, sort of self-explanatory, but we're talking about the sending, the message, medium, sender, and receiver in an organization. And how that message, how efficiently that message from the commander down flows, how that information flows up and down between the commander and the unit. The employee relations, these are your things, your SAPR stuff, your unit climate assessment, which is now the DOCS, and it's a long acronym, but basically the health, the morale, the welfare of the people in the unit. That's the employee relations. How do they interact with each other? How fruitful is your booster club? Do you have social events, and how often are they? And do people participate? Is the spouses club good? That's human relations. And then change management, something we overlook a lot from a leadership development standpoint in the military, and it's extremely important. And Todd Henry's talked to you yesterday morning about, he had that quad chart up there that showed, what was this, stability versus challenge at the top. So on the far right was stability and top was challenge. And the change management process is the easiest way to mess all of that up. Because if people in the end of your change don't understand why the change happened or where the change is taking them and whatnot, but they still have a lot of work, they're still challenged. Now they're going to be challenged and unstable, and they're going to be angry. And if they are not challenged and unstable, then they're going to be lost. So if you mess up change management, you have people that are lost or angry. So we don't want that. So it's important to touch on that issue as well. So we're going to touch, those are the 7 areas that we're going to hit. So here's what we found. Give you a minute to sink that in. So I love this chart, and I didn't love it at first because it's one of the most confusing things to view. But there's 33 people in this room that were in a lab this morning that could probably explain this to you. It makes a lot of sense. But we're going to walk through this process just really quickly so you understand how we got to the answers. Because in the end, I'm not trying to stand up here and give you leadership advice. I want you to receive the information that 30 commanders agreed upon that are effective practices and processes that they wish or did do during their command experience to go to you. And to receive that, you need to understand the quality of the information. So we came up with this chart by starting here. Anybody read that out? No? So each one of those lines, each horizontal line of mixed colors is an interview. You'll see there's 7 colors, like the top one in the top left there is green, 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 green all the way across. That commander felt like they were 5s everywhere. So his unit was very effective according to his opinion, and he shared why, and the why, the narrative is in the block. And I don't expect you to be able to read that. I just want you to understand that for 30 different interviews for an hour and a half, we went through and got detailed descriptions of whether they felt they were effective or ineffective, and you'll see that highlighted by the colors. The red means, hey, maybe we weren't effective in communication. If it's green, then we were effective in communication. Yellow, maybe it was a 3, they rated it neutral. And then they explain why, so we understand the context to be able to interpret all that and compare the answers and give it back to you. That's what this is. So each comment will look like something like this. So this commander rated as a 4, provided some experiences, the inappropriate sexual assault and unit climate assessment, talked through some different details of why they thought it was a 4. Also helped with getting me to think on how to delegate so I can focus on long-term strategic tasks. So you'll see things like that. So as we go through these are the themes: the leadership, the human relations, the performance improvements. Those are all the themes. What we get out of this are nodes. So as I dig through this information, I can see, okay, this commander talked about the benefits of focusing on strategic tasks versus fighting fires. That is a node. So then I might see the same kind of thing in another interview, and another interview, and another interview. And those are the things that we bring before you today, because in the end, they create a list like this, to where regardless of who said it, now we take out the commanders, the individual interviews, and line up how many times something came up. And then you start to see that across columns. So you'll see strategic task in this column, and then also in this column, it's like, wait a minute. So there's a relationship. So if I focus on this, not only do I impact leadership, but I might impact something else. And Dr. Conley, he's going to go ahead into some detail on that correlation chart. That was a chart I showed you before, the confusing red and green lines all over the place. He's going to go into that for you a little bit. I'm going to talk to you about the individual items in each theme. So those are the nodes, and we're going to pop those up here in a little bit, talk about what they mean under each category. So when we talk about leadership team effectiveness, the strength of that team had a significant impact on the effectiveness of that squadron. Now that team, like I said, was different. There were some commanders that split their duties to where I am the commander and I focus on awards, the administrative UCMJ stuff, the NGP stuff, and the promotions, and my DO runs my squadron. Their job is the day-to-day operations. That's what my ops officer does. There are other commanders, especially in smaller squadrons, where they share the duties and they split them. How they work that relationship, how their communication was, some people were gapping a first sergeant, some people were gapping a chief master sergeant, so they didn't have a superintendent, and that really hurt their team. Some folks had DOs that weren't qualified to do the job or underperformed, and they talked about that in there. So the biggest factor that impacted how effective the team was at leading the unit was actually the strength of the team itself. Takeaway from this, as you move on, if you haven't been a commander yet and you take command, or even when you take higher level command, one of the things that you need to focus on is building that team strength and that communication and that effectiveness of your leadership team so that you can serve the unit that you're there to serve. That's why I love my wing that I'm in now. I'm in a 505th Command and Control wing, and all of our org charts are upside down. The wing commander's at the bottom, and all the lines kind of branch up with the squadrons at the top because the wing commander's there to serve us, the group commanders serve them. And that's kind of the focus when you think about this. The stronger your team is, the more you can serve the people that you're there to serve. Focus on strategic tasks versus fighting fires was another element. A lot of commanders said either I wish I had a more effective team that where I could focus on the strategic tasks, or they said I did have an effective team and I was able to delegate things and trust my airmen and get things down to them and focus on things that only I as the commander can do. So there's things that only I as the commander can sign, there's things that only I as the commander can make the decision on. Those are the things that a commander should focus on if they want to maximize their effectiveness. You have to have the right team in place, you have to know your airmen, you have to trust your airmen. General Quast talked about that yesterday, his 4 elements. So one was discerning personalities, the second was trust, the third one was, I forget. So the first 2 are the ones that are relevant to this. So knowing your airmen and be able to trust them, that's what's really important about being able to focus on strategic tasks, because you have to delegate. You have to be able to do that. For training, which is an area that we often fall short in the military, I actually came in, I was at a training squadron when I was a captain, and I had a 3-year assignment there, and we were grossly underfunded, even as a whole squadron that's supposed to be focused on training. But then in all my other squadrons, the training in the squadron usually under-resourced, and the commanders during these interviews that talked about effective training, they focused on the fact that they resourced it early, they focused on it early, they made it a priority, and later when resourcing wasn't exactly what they needed it to be, they didn't suffer as a result. And there are other areas that would benefit from that, and Dan's going to talk about that in a little bit as well. I don't want to steal his thunder. Training needs to be realistic. There's commanders that actually were, and I was surprised at the frequency of this, that would set up bare base setups on their base. They go out and set up tents either outside their building or in one of the public areas to where they would operate, they'd have their airmen operate out of there for a few days just so they knew that their airmen could function with the deployed style of equipment that they had and in an environment that was not a nice, comfy, climate-controlled office. Because that training is now realistic. It's fruitful for them. They all frowned upon the CBTs and things that we can't get away from. So the realistic training, if you're going to do training, make it real. Don't just do it to get it done and check the box. Make it realistic and put the time in to get some value out of it. For customer service, providing that value back out, customers are priority. There were a lot of commanders, surprisingly, that said, you know, a lot of times in a wing, especially the way we're doing wings now, right? Like we've completely changed the way we structure wings in the Air Force. We have air base wings all over the place, which means it's the host wing mostly. And then on, like at the Hill, I'm at Hill right now, we have an air base wing. On the air base wing, you have the Life Cycle Management Center. We have 2 different fighter wings. And then I'm an ACC unit that's 1 squadron on that base. The rest of my wings all over the place. And at Hill, they have the 75th Air Base Wing personnel office and all the people to provide customer support out to all the units. they have to tailor their processes and their methods to the different unit needs, different MAGCOMs, and they do that, and that's effective. And the commanders that spoke best about customer service focused on the fact that they were willing to take the time and effort to tailor to the customer's needs and make the customer the priority. They treated phone calls like they were in person. They would go out and they would reach out to the other organizations, which ties into the next one, inter-unit relationships. They would connect with the other units to understand their mission and understand how the service that they provide feeds back into that unit so that everybody can benefit from it. So that was a big advantage there. Under performance improvement, the awards program, surprisingly, was the biggest one. That was the biggest piece of performance improvement. I thought it was going to be feedbacks, but in these series of interviews, awards was one of the biggest mentioned issues, and it was managing awards properly, making sure the right people get the awards, making sure that the wrong people don't get the awards, and making sure the program is clear. And a lot of commanders actually walked into a unit that had a weak awards program or no awards program, and this was something they focused on right away and benefited from by walking in and addressing this area right up front. Setting high standards, which ties into that awards program. You set the high standards and then you reward the people that do it. And a lot of commanders were surprised. They thought the unit was going to fall apart because they were going to come in and be the bad guy. Anybody here not seen 12 o'clock high? Like 12 o'clock high, the general comes in and everybody hated him at first, and in the end they realized what he was doing, and he was trying to set the standard up to get the team built. This has been a lot of the experience of the commanders that I interviewed, that when they walk into a unit that is either average or underperforms and they try to take it to the next level, they were surprised to be met with a unit that adapted to their style and stepped up their game to meet those standards. So for all of you stepping out there to be commanders, again, not my word for it, this is their word, of all these people that agreed on it, something to consider as you walk into a unit. If you don't think the standards are where they should be, don't be afraid to step up the game and hold people accountable. Same thing, I know there's some enlisted folks out there for first shirts, superintendents, same deal. Same principles apply. And then effectively manage talent. Yesterday, General Quast mentioned talent management. He talked about it from a hiring perspective. I would offer that at most of our level, we can't really decide who we hire and don't hire. And so you get who you get, and you do have to learn the people. Like he said, you have to discern the personalities, identify strengths and weaknesses, and based on doing that, take your star performers and put them in the right roles. Put them in your key projects and pair them up with somebody that might not be a star performer to get things done. And he talked about that a little bit. I don't want to belabor that too much, but what he was saying from his personal experience is echoed or was echoed throughout the past year during these interviews with these squadron commanders. So something for you to consider. Change management. This is one of those things. Change management, like I said before, we don't always do this right in the Air Force. We're not trained. When you go to Squadron Commander's course, they don't teach you organizational management and organizational development, how to move pieces, to freeze things, to change them, to unfreeze them. So this is something we usually figure out by fumbling through it. And so these are key points that folks said they either wish they did or they did effectively during change management. And one is communicate regularly. When you execute change, you are altering people's lives. If it's civilians in the organization, then you're talking about their core documents. Civilians are priced out based on the people they supervise and the type of work they do and the level of work they do and how many people removed they are from the folks above them. And when you change that, when you reorg or restructure, you are changing their potential pay grade, and that's their lives. And while in a perfect world, none of that would matter, right? The mission is this, it's changed this, we need to look like this to do it. In the real world, we have people that are involved with this, people's lives and feelings, and these same people that have to be motivated to follow you and accomplish your mission, and you don't want to lose them because you did something without communicating the impact of that, being transparent about what that impact is going to have and how that's going to affect them, and then making sure they understand their role now and whether or not and or how their role is going to change in the future when this new organization has emerged. So being transparent, communicating that, and making sure your airmen understand their role in the bigger picture, and you'll see that when that one comes up in a lot of different places, and Dan will talk about that. That's extremely important. Communication, leadership by walking around. We've all heard this before, but not a lot of people do it. Well, I say not a lot. There are people that still don't do that. Even in these interviews, there were commanders that did not do that enough, or those that did it and it worked well for them. But either way, Whether they didn't do it and it was bad or they did it and it was good, it's sending the same message, that that is a piece that will impact the effectiveness of communication in your organization. You got to be careful about that. I was telling a group earlier, I was, even just last week, we have 2 different radar systems in my unit, and I went back to our radar evaluation section, and I was like, hey, I thought Sergeant such worked on this system because he sits over here. And the master was like, no, they just sit all over the place, and the NCOICs are spaced, but they know who their people are. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's no worries. And I walked away, and I go back Friday before leaving to come out here, and they're all moved. All of them were moved around, and they were organized based on where they sit. And I was like, did you guys move to get a window seat? And they're like, no, sir. I was like, did you guys move because I asked a question last week? He said, yes, sir, we were told to move. So be careful as you walk around, the influence and impact that you'll have doing that. So it's a fine line of getting around and not being disruptive as well. And I obviously crossed that line last week. That was one of my little experiences. Janelle, yesterday, she talked about mindfulness, and she presented to you that, 46% of the day is spent mind wandering? Right? What better way to make sure you're not mind wandering if you're physically wandering, right? So if you're physically wandering, you can't mind wander. Open door policy. This one was interesting to me because a lot of us hear about an open door policy. Some commanders don't have it. There were commanders in these interviews that didn't have it, and that worked well for them. There were other commanders, and we say open door, I think there should be different levels. Like my current squadron commander, our squadron's 84 people, relatively small for an ops squadron. We have 84 people, and my commander, I would say, has a no-door policy. So folks at any point can come up, and if they need to talk about something, he makes time for them. He pulls away from what he's doing. That style works for him, and it works for him in this unit as it is right now, right? All those things are important, because any of those things changing, that doesn't work. Some commanders have an open door, some have a very open, and then like my commander has a no-door policy pretty much. The policy that you use is going to depend on your organization. Size, we're going to get into that a little bit. The size of your organization matters. If you're an OSS commander, security forces commander, you have 500 people, 400 people, training squadron commander, you don't want 200 students walking into your open door policy anytime they want. But if you're in contract and you're a comptroller or have a small ops squadron, then maybe you can afford to be more relaxed with that policy and make more time to see folks. That's based on you. But that varied, but either way, commanders found some sort of benefit in whatever form was appropriate for them. And then the unit size mattered. This mattered for communication in so many different ways. Having commanders calls, now you have 3 or 4 instead of 1 or 2 because you have folks on shift work or people that are displaced in GSUs, so you have to find VTC equipment to talk to them. And so unit size and distribution impacted the effectiveness of communication. And that's out of your control. So basically the point out of this is if you take command and you get a small unit, some of these things will be easier for you theoretically than larger units. And larger units will most likely have more trouble with some of these people or some of these elements because of the size of the unit. And then the last one, employee relations. The biggest thing here, and the only node that really emerged is consistent throughout all of them, is everybody outlined a policy for respect. Every commander had a respect policy. And a lot of us are familiar with Green Dot. And I know that the training, we're like, oh, I got to go to Green Dot. But the one thing I like about Green Dot training is Green Dot, it's a way for us to kind of think about the fact that it's really just about mutual respect. It's about creating an environment where people respect one another, where you respect differences and similarities. And commanders who focused on that had that and enforced it, they found that the relationships in their unit were better because of it. Something for you to consider there. So out of that, we saw things that emerged in multiple places, but how can you use this to maximize your impact? So I have all those lists of things that I went through, and those were like the top 1, 2, or 3 things in that category. There was a whole bunch. I definitely didn't do the commanders all the justice I could have in this paper. It came out to 25 pages. It'll be an Aerospace Power Journal, but you have to shorten things up to get it out there so people read it. But there's tons of information can get on there. But you see these things over and over in different columns and across columns, and that's where you get something like this that shows you how you can maximize impact, which Dr. Connolly is going to address now.
Clicker, please. All right, Jason, thanks a lot. Can you all hear me out there? Can you see me out there? Okay, we'll do our best. You've heard from Major Newcomer on the purpose and the method of our study and something about the findings. It's now my task to turn this a little more to the practical for your benefit. You should also be aware that the full paper comes out as an article in the spring issue of Air and Space Power Journal. First, if we look at the chart where I think most of the value of this is actually captured if you spend a little time with it, pay attention to the direction of the arrows because that's significant. The direction of the arrows actually implies input and outcome. And if you take a look at that, you might see that there's some surprising connections there in the way these relationships are defined. For example, that communication is viewed as an output, that training is viewed in a way as an output or an outcome, and what goes into those to make them higher quality. And that's where I feel, and Jason feels, a lot of the value of this resides. According to the interviews that we conducted with these men and women, for example, if you look at the lower left, it appears that if you want to improve training or customer service, the important thing to do is to focus on resourcing those activities. I recommend this to you because the key difference for action here, based on your time and attention as a commander, is to treat training and customer service here as actually outcomes. In other words, trying to improve them a lot on the front end without paying a lot of attention to how you're resourcing them behind the lines can end up being counterproductive. A second point here on the chart, the most vital factors in quickly turning around a squadron or improving its performance might not make the list in terms of what you or I might comprise on our own in terms of what had the most impact. But these 30 commanders had their own list, and we consolidated that information for your benefit, and you might have some surprises there as well. Remember that these 30 commanders did this work in the interviews after they had experienced successes and failures on the job. Well, the next few slides are going to help continue to tell that story. Okay, realize here that part of the reason for the importance of resources implied in the data may be that the morale enhancement factor affected the people who are conducting that work and receiving it. That actually that's where you're affecting these activities because they are being resourced. Also, the raw data from the interviews hinted that more investment in training predicted better customer service, whether to customers or other units. So the idea here is for commanders who can't be everywhere, that the way to maximize the impact that your organization has on others is through training. In addition to this finding on resources, commanders highlighted how the pace of operations affected training and communication within the unit. And for anyone who served or ran people under 24/7 ops, myself included in Intel, you know that the effect is huge. In fact, around-the-clock ops hurt these particular functions within the squadron. Training suffered in quality. The results of training suffered as well, particularly when consistency and standardization across training was more important depending on the mission of the squadron. Secondly, in these 24-hour operations environments, communication in the unit suffered sometimes dramatically. The typical impact was that it blunted the effects of tools that you and I might take for granted, like commanders' calls and also leadership presence. Our research suggested countering these training challenges in such units by even more commander emphasis on training, an important finding that we uncovered. Okay, multiple times we saw the comm issue haunting commanders, regardless of the pace of operations, but particularly in units that had a higher pace of activity. We heard regret consistently that when day-to-day details took a lot of the commander's time away, it turned their attention away from this comm problem. The result being that the day-to-day problems also grew over time. Because without addressing the comm problem, you were handling these problems, but not in a way that was holistic to the organization. So you actually ended up slightly failing at both. Moving on, our data also addressed the practice of leadership by walking around. Jason already referenced this item. It's hardly a new idea, as he noted, and I'm telling you that, and you know that as well. But a good question to ask is why it works. What is it that makes it effective? Two more questions that you might ask to make your leadership by walking around have more impact. How do I maximize the value of it? And then finally, what do I risk when I skip it? The interviews revealed the power of this particular practice. Visibility and availability clearly make a difference. The data also suggested that subordinates' faith was enhanced by this practice, particularly faith in the commander and faith in the future. Now, this became crucial in the interviews when the attention of the interviewee focused on change management. As change management became more important, this was a signal for the commander who succeeded to avoid letting the minutia of managing change keep you from that vital walking around whenever it could be afforded. Moving on, the issue of transparency was so large that it tended to encompass almost all other points on the chart. That's why we're going to emphasize it right now, especially you'll notice the 5 items listed here. When commanders failed at one of these other primary tasks, they often ended up citing lack of transparency as a cause. The meaning here seems clear. Okay, don't expect other leadership behaviors to allow you to communicate transparency or demonstrate it. In fact, take control of this. Work directly on being more transparent as much as possible as part of your leadership style. And the transparency will add power to your actions on multiple levels. Key learning here, rather than simply focusing on building trust and trust showing up as transparency, is that transparency creates trust. Next, the commanders also revealed in the interviews the effects the amount of personnel under them had on their leadership. Jason addressed this briefly. What adds to the challenges of squadron size is the number of problems that tend to grow with that, according to these commanders. And as we noted, this is usually beyond the commander's control. Larger squadrons disrupted communication and supervision and frayed relationships among personnel. More significant, the data suggests that some commanders tended to ignore this issue and prioritized other concerns as if the sheer number of personnel wasn't a factor that needed to be dealt with as a top-notch concern. When they tended to downplay that issue, other problems also grew in scale and importance. Unit cohesion tended to suffer as well. And then finally, topic of communication appeared to be the most significant of all. Effective use of leadership by walking around, dealing effectively with the problems of the size of the squadron in the data hinged on emphasizing communication. Those commanders that succeeded pinned their success in these areas on communication, such as we talked about a clearly articulated and a reasonable open door policy, an opportunity for communication with the commander. Commanders often praise the value of this policy regardless of how often it was actually taken advantage of. Now there's a bigger point on communication I'm going to save for the conclusion slide. Moving on, the interviews pointed heavily toward commanders needing to take role awareness seriously. Disconnectedness of personnel from the mission and from the larger units they support and that they're under, this came up repeatedly. As you can imagine, it came up retroactively after the lack of attention to role awareness. Special note here is that change management, when mishandled, was frequently viewed in retrospect as a failure on this exact account, the issue of role awareness. Airmen that did not tend to appreciate their role responded especially negatively to change, and commanders had to work uphill against this resistance. All right, the next topic, empowering airmen with decision power and resources, aided these commanders in change management and on a host of other fronts, as you can see from the slide. This key finding showed up in the leadership category, where commanders were pointing to a battle that Jason referenced about the challenge between strategic focus and then merely fighting fires. Repeatedly, commanders voiced that when they failed to manage change well, or when employee relations or performance tended to slip, The cause was a failure to first seek to empower airmen, to empower them before a crisis through dedicated actions to try to restructure the work to help this so empowerment can build up, turned out to be extremely valuable. All right, I want to leave you with what we hope are two valuable conclusions before I leave it to Major Newcomer to wrap us up. Consider first our mental map of the nodes that you saw as levers for commanders to push. Some of them are going to be more valuable and time effective than others. For example, the research so far suggests that communication, transparency, and empowering airmen are fundamental to success at the squadron level on a ton of dimensions. So to be overtaken by events and shift too much attention away from these, at least in the eyes of these 30 people, brings too steep a price down the road. The multi-nodal ties, especially when you saw a theme with a node and it had multiple connections in terms of outcomes, suggests that commanders can solve multiple problems by focusing improvement on one track. That ought to get all of our attention. Finally, I promised a topic on communication as a last one. This will need more investigating, but the interviews indicated that communication is both the basis of both relationships and command itself. Let me explain a little what I mean. Some people have argued that education, for example, is misunderstood because it's viewed as its own subject rather than as a method or a medium. In the same way, some people can misunderstand leadership and command, misunderstanding communication's centrality if they tend to see communication as merely another element of leadership rather than the medium of leadership. So according to these interviews, the ones reflecting on their command saw that leadership was not purely a mental event, but occurs in relationships with others, and only through communication or leadership doesn't happen. This is something important to think about. What's the bottom line? The mistake here might be for commanders to assume that the quality of communication in a unit and from themselves is merely another leadership element or leadership factor to be handled as time allows. The solution here might be to accept that communication, for the sake of argument, is leadership. While communication can be consciously improved before a crisis, when the crisis hits, it's almost always a great and powerful predictor of the outcome of such a crisis. I want to close with a quick piece of anecdotal evidence. One of the commanders interviewed made the comment that it took him about a year to work out some of his blind spots, and that after that year of command, he saw that he was becoming more effective. So my final note, ladies and gentlemen, work out those blind spots now. We all have them. Now is the time.
And I appreciate you all for being here, and I appreciate you for your time. Thank you.